$500 for the cowboy and his mangy donkey? Celestine Ravenworth's champagne flute trembled as she raised her jeweled hand, her silk dress rustling against the dusty auction bench. The entire crowd of Millbrook's finest turned to stare at the railroad heiress, who'd never bid on anything more practical than a Persian rug. The auctioneer's gavel hung suspended in midair. "Did I hear 500 for lot 17? On the makeshift stage, Boone Coleridge stood 6'8" in his weathered boots, his massive frame casting shadows across the afternoon sun. His calloused hands rested protectively on his donkey, Gertie's neck, both of them looking like relics from a bygone era. The bank had seized his ranch that morning, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and his loyal companion. "This is madness," whispered Cordelia Ashworth, Celestine's closest friend among the town's social elite. "Al, what are you going to do with a giant cowboy?" Celestine's emerald eyes sparkled with mischief and something deeper, a longing she couldn't name. For 32 years she'd lived in her father's shadow, managing his railroad empire from her pristine office surrounded by ledgers and lonely nights. But watching this mountain of a man face his humiliation with quiet dignity stirred something wild in her chest. 600, called out Jeremiah Stockton, the cattle baron who'd been eyeing Boone's land for months. 1,000. Shot to her feet, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The crowd gasped. Boone's storm-gray eyes met hers across the distance, confusion flickering in their depths. He'd heard of the Ravenworth woman everyone had. She was railroad royalty, untouchable as morning frost, with more money than half the county combined. Sold to Miss Ravenworth. The gavel cracked like thunder. As the crowd dispersed in excited whispers, Celestine approached the stage on unsteady legs. Up close, Boone was even more imposing, broad shoulders that could carry the world, hands that spoke of honest labor, and eyes that held depths she wanted to explore. "Ma'am," he tipped his worn hat, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "I appreciate what you've done, but I gotta ask, what exactly are your intentions?" Gertie snorted and nuzzled Celestine's expensive sleeve, leaving a dusty mark. Instead of recoiling, Celestine found herself laughing the first genuine laugh she'd had in years. "I honestly don't know," she admitted, meeting his gaze. "But I couldn't watch them separate you two. Besides, my estate needs a groundskeeper." It was a lie. Her estate had a full staff. But something about this gentle giant and his devoted donkey called to the lonely corners of her heart. Boone studied her face, searching for mockery or pity. Instead, he found something that made his chest tight, genuine kindness, and perhaps a loneliness that matched his own. "Well then, Miss Ravenworth," he said slowly, "I reckon Gertie and I are in your service." As they walked toward her waiting carriage, neither noticed how perfectly their steps matched, or how the afternoon sun seemed to bless their unlikely meeting. With golden light, the Ravenworth estate sprawled across 300 acres of pristine Colorado countryside, its Victorian mansion rising like a jeweled crown against the Rocky Mountain backdrop. As Celestine's carriage wound up the cobblestone drive, she stole glances at her unusual acquisition. Boone sat rigid beside her, his massive frame dwarfing the velvet seats, while Gertie trotted contentedly behind them. He hadn't spoken since they'd left town, and Celestine found herself growing nervous. What had seemed like a romantic impulse at the auction now felt like sheer madness. "Your home is mighty impressive, ma'am," Boone finally said as the mansion came into view. "Hey, please. Call me Celestine." She smoothed her skirts, suddenly conscious of the gulf between their worlds. "The groundskeeper's cottage is just beyond the rose gardens. It's been empty for months." What she didn't mention was that she'd fired the previous groundskeeper for his laziness, and the cottage had remained vacant because she'd been too particular about finding a replacement. Now she wondered if fate had been saving it for this moment. Hyacinth Morgenstern, the head housekeeper, met them at the front steps with barely concealed horror. Her steel-gray hair was pulled into its usual severe bun, and her narrow face radiated disapproval. "Miss Celestine, surely you don't intend to. Mr. Coleridge will be staying in the groundskeeper's cottage." Celestine interrupted firmly. "Please have it prepared immediately." Boone dismounted with fluid grace despite his size. "Ma'am, I don't need any special preparations. Gertie and I are used to simple accommodations. But Celestine was already marching toward the cottage, her heels clicking against the stone path. The small building sat nestled among ancient oak trees, its windows dark and lonely. Inside, dust motes danced in the fading sunlight, and the air held the musty scent of disuse. "It's perfect," Boone said quietly, running his hand along the solid oak table. "More than perfect. Haven't had a real roof over my head in weeks?" The simple gratitude in his voice made Celestine's throat tight. She'd grown up surrounded by luxury, never wanting for anything material, yet this man found joy in basic shelter. "There's a small stable out back for Gertie," she said, her voice softer now, "in the gardens. Well, they've been sadly neglected. I'm afraid I'm better with numbers than growing things." Boone stepped closer, and she caught the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. "What kind of numbers?" "Railroad schedules, shipping manifests, profit margins." She gestured helplessly. "My father built an empire, and I've been trying to maintain it since he passed. But sometimes I think I've forgotten how to live while focusing on making a living." Something shifted in Boone's expression of recognition, perhaps of kindred loneliness. "I understand that feeling. Spent so many years building my ranch, working from sunup to sundown, that I forgot to enjoy what I was working for. Drought came, and the bank. Well, you saw how that ended." They stood in comfortable silence as evening painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Through the cottage window, they could see Gertie grazing contentedly in the meadow beyond. "Boone," Celestine said suddenly, then blushed at her use of his first name. "I want you to know this isn't charity. I genuinely need help with the grounds. And perhaps you could teach me about growing things." He smiled for the first time since she'd met him, and the transformation was breathtaking. Lines crinkled around his eyes, and his whole face softened with warmth. "I'd be honored, Miss Celestine. Though I should warn you, Gertie's got strong opinions about gardening. She thinks everything green was put on this earth for her personal consumption." As if summoned by her name, Gertie appeared at the window, her long ears framed by the golden light. Celestine laughed, and the sound seemed to chase away the cottage's loneliness. For the first time in years, the Ravenworth estate felt like home. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the estate, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Celestine had barely slept, her mind churning with thoughts of her mysterious new groundskeeper. She'd risen before her usual hour, abandoning her silk nightgown for a simple cotton dress she hadn't worn in years. Outside her window, she could see Boone already at work in the neglected vegetable garden, his powerful shoulders moving in rhythm. As he turned the soil, Gertie supervised from nearby, occasionally offering her own form of help by sampling the weeds he'd pulled. "Miss Celestine, your breakfast is ready," Hyacinth announced from the doorway, her tone carrying a note of disapproval that had only grown stronger overnight. "I'll take it in the garden," Celestine replied, surprising them both. "The garden?" "But miss, there's a first time for everything, Hyacinth." Minutes later, Celestine found herself balancing a tea tray as she picked her way across the dewy grass. She'd traded her usual heeled boots for simple leather shoes, and her hair hung in a loose braid instead of its customary elegant chignon. Boone looked up at her approach, dirt streaking his forearms and a puzzled expression crossing his features. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" "I brought coffee," she said, then immediately felt foolish. "I thought you might be thirsty." The truth was, she'd been watching him work from her window like a lovesick schoolgirl, fascinated by the easy confidence with which he moved through the world. Everything about him spoke of strength and competence, qualities that made her own sheltered existence feel suddenly hollow. "That's mighty thoughtful." Boone wiped his hands on his worn jeans before accepting the steaming cup. "Though I should mention, ma'am, this garden's in worse shape than I first thought. Soil's been neglected for years." Celestine knelt beside the freshly turned earth, her cotton skirts pooling around her. "Show me," she said simply. For the next hour, Boone taught her to read the language of soil, how to feel for moisture and nutrients, how to judge the balance of clay and loam. His hands covered hers as he guided her fingers through the dirt, and Celestine found herself breathless at the contact. "You're a quick learner," he said, his voice low and warm. I'm a good student when I have the right teacher." Their eyes met and held, and Celestine felt the world narrow to just this moment, the morning sun on her face, the rich earth beneath her hands, and the steady presence of this remarkable man beside her, Miss Celestine. Hyacinth scandalized. Voice shattered the spell. "Mr. Montgomery Blackwell is here to see you. He's waiting in the parlor." Celestine's heart sank. Montgomery was her father's old business partner, a pompous man 20 years her senior who'd been pursuing her relentlessly. Since her father's death, she'd managed to avoid his advances so far, but he was persistent as a tick. "Tell him I'm indisposed," she said, without taking her eyes off Boone. "Ma'am, he says it's urgent business regarding the railroad merger." Boone had gone very still beside her. "Should go," he said quietly. "Business is important." But as Celestine reluctantly rose and brushed the dirt from her skirts, she caught the flash of something in Boone's expression, a reminder of the gulf between their worlds. He was a displaced cowboy working her land for room and board, while she was negotiating million-dollar mergers and silk-lined parlors. "This evening," she said firmly, "I want to learn about companion planting." Boone's smile was soft but distant. "Of course, ma'am, whatever you wish." As she walked back toward the house, Celestine didn't see Boone watching her go, his calloused hands clenched at his sides. Nor did she notice Montgomery Blackwell observing them both from the parlor window, his cold eyes calculating the potential threat this rustic giant might pose to his carefully laid plans. The game, it seemed, was about to become far more complicated. Montgomery Blackwell paced the elegant parlor like a predator, his silver-headed cane tapping against the Persian rug with each step. When Celestine entered, still brushing garden soil from her hands, his pale blue eyes narrowed with displeasure. "My dear Celestine," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, but twice as bitter. "What on earth were you doing consorting with?" "The help. Good morning to you too, Montgomery." Celestine settled into her father's leather chair, a deliberate choice that emphasized her position as head of the railroad empire. Hyacinth mentioned urgent business? Indeed. Montgomery's gaze swept over her simple dress and loose hair with obvious disapproval. "The Denver Pacific merger requires your immediate attention, but I find myself concerned about ... distractions." Through the tall windows, they could see Boone continuing his work in the garden, Gertie now helping herself to a patch of wild clover nearby. Montgomery's expression darkened as he watched the cowboy's easy movements. "That man is hardly a distraction." Celestine lied smoothly. "He's my groundskeeper." "A groundskeeper you purchased at auction like a prized bull." Montgomery moved closer, his presence oppressive in the morning bright room. "People are talking, Celestine. Such behavior is unseemly for a woman of your station." Heat flashed through Celestine's chest. "My station? Now what station is that, Montgomery?" "The one where I'm expected to be a decorative figurehead while men like you make the real decisions." "The station," Montgomery said coldly, "of my future wife." The words hung in the air like a threat. Celestine had known this moment would come. Eventually, Montgomery had been circling her inheritance like a vulture since her father's funeral, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her stomach clench with revulsion. "I've never agreed to marry you," she said carefully. "Haven't you?" Montgomery produced a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "The merger requires unified leadership. Your father understood this. Before his death, we had ... an understanding." Celestine's blood turned to ice as she scanned the documents. Her father's signature was there, clear as day, on a preliminary marriage contract tied to the business merger. She'd been so focused on learning the railroad business that she'd missed this particular poison pill. "This is unconscionable," she whispered. "This is business." Montgomery's smile was sharp as winter wind. "The wedding will take place within the month, and a rustic employee, will be dismissed immediately. I won't tolerate gossip about my wife's inappropriate associations." Outside, Boone had noticed something was wrong. Through the window, he could see Celestine's rigid posture, the predatory way the silver-haired man loomed over her. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but what right did a displaced cowboy have to interfere in the affairs of railroad royalty? "I need time to consider," Celestine said, her voice barely steady. "Time is a luxury we don't have." "The board meets next week." Montgomery gathered his papers with satisfied efficiency. I'll return tomorrow for your answer. And Celestine, try to remember who your real friends are. After he left, Celestine sat alone in the parlor, her hands shaking as she reread the marriage contract. Through the window, she watched Boone teaching Gertie to avoid the tender seedlings. His patience and gentleness a stark contrast to Montgomery's cold manipulation. That evening, she found Boone waiting by the garden gate as promised, a small collection of seed packets in his weathered hands. But when he looked at her face, he set them aside immediately.
"What's wrong?"
he asked simply. And for the first time since her father's death, Celestine let herself break down. The story poured out of Hertha, forced merger, the marriage contract, the trap her father had unknowingly set for her. Boone listened without judgment, his presence steady as the mountains. There has to be another way, he said when she finished. There isn't. Celestine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I have to choose between my freedom and my father's legacy. Boone was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. When he spoke, his voice was soft but determined. What if there was a third option? The Predon air crackled with possibility as Celestine met Boone by the stable, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd barely slept, Montgomery's ultimatum warring with Boone's mysterious promise of a third option. Now watching him saddle her father's old horse with practiced efficiency, she wondered if she'd finally lost her mind. You sure about this? Boone asked, checking the leather straps one final time. Gertie stood nearby, saddled with small travel packs, her long ears twitching with anticipation. I'm sure about nothing anymore, Celestine admitted. She'd traded her fine dresses for riding clothes borrowed from the staff leather boots, wool, trousers, and a simple cotton shirt that made her feel like a different person entirely. But I trust you. The words surprised them both with their simple honesty. Boone had spent the night researching in her father's extensive library, poring over railroad maps and legal documents by lamplight. What he'd discovered could change everything if they were brave enough to seize the opportunity. The Northern Cross Line, he explained, as they rode through the misty valley, runs through 3 territories that aren't officially part of the merger yet. If you could secure those routes independently, I could maintain control without Montgomery's interference, Celestine finished, understanding dawning in her emerald eyes. But those territories are controlled by the Shoshone Nation. No railroad company has successfully negotiated passage through their lands. It's no railroad company run by men like Montgomery, Boone corrected. But you're not like them, they rode. In comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Celestine found herself stealing glances at her companion, marveling at how natural he looked in the saddle, how the morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. When had she stopped seeing him as an acquisition and started seeing him as ... What exactly? Boone? She said suddenly. Why are you helping me? Could have taken the money I paid for you and started over anywhere. He reined in his horse, turning to face her fully. The intensity in his storm-gray eyes made her breath catch. I guess in 38 years of living, I've never met anyone like you, he said simply. You bought me at auction not to own me, but to set me free. You knelt in the dirt to learn about growing things. You laugh at Gertie's antics instead of complaining about the mess she makes. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about you as my employer and started thinking about you as the woman I'm falling in love with. The confession hung between them like morning mist, fragile and beautiful. Celestine's heart soared. Even as her practical mind catalogued all the reasons this was impossible, their different backgrounds, Montgomery's threats, the scandal it would cause. Boone, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I know the gulf between us. Just wanted you to know that someone sees who you really are, not just what you represent. But Celestine was already dismounting, her feet barely touching the ground. Before she was standing before him, her hands reaching up to frame his weathered face. You beautiful, impossible man, she breathed. Don't you know I've been falling in love with you since that first morning in the garden? Their kiss was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as years of loneliness dissolved in the space between heartbeats. When they finally broke apart, Gertie snorted loudly, as if to remind them they had more pressing matters to attend to. Shoshone settlement is another day's ride, Boone said, his forehead resting against hers. Are you ready for this? Celestine thought of Montgomery waiting for her answer. Of the board meeting that would seal her fate. Of the choice between love and legacy that no longer seemed like a choice at all. With you, I'm ready for anything. As they rode deeper into the wilderness. Neither noticed the lone rider following them from a distance, one of Montgomery's men. Tasked with ensuring the wayward heiress didn't do anything too foolish, but then Montgomery had always underestimated the lengths to which desperate people would go for freedom. The real adventure was just beginning. The Shoshone settlement sprawled along the banks of Eagle Creek. Its traditional lodges mixed with newer log structures in a harmony that spoke of a people adapting while honoring their roots. As Celestine, Boone, and Gertie approached the village outskirts, curious children peered at them from behind painted teepees, while elders watched with the patient wariness of those who had seen too many broken promises from white settlers. Remember? Boone murmured as they dismounted. Chief Washakie has dealt with railroad men before. He'll be testing you from the moment we meet. Celestine straightened her shoulders, drawing on every lesson her father had taught her about negotiation and respect. But as they were escorted through the village by a stern-faced warrior named Spotted Wolf, she realized this was unlike any business meeting she'd ever faced. Chief Washakie sat in the council lodge, his weathered hands folded over a staff carved with symbols that told the story of his people. His dark eyes studied Celestine with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight into her soul. Another railroad woman comes to steal our land, he said in accented English, his voice carrying the weight of decades. What makes you different from the others? Nothing, Celestine replied honestly, earning surprised looks from the assembled council members. I'm here because I need something from you. But unlike the others, I'm willing to offer something in return that might actually benefit your people. Chief Washakie's eyebrows rose slightly. Speak. For the next hour, Celestine laid out her proposal. Instead of simply buying passage rights, she offered the Shoshone Nation partial ownership in the railroad line. Profits from their territorial routes would flow back to the tribe, along with guaranteed employment for their young men and respect. For their sacred sites, you would make us partners, not just sell us empty promises, asked an elder named Blue Hawk. More than partners, Celestine said. I would learn from you. Your people understand this land in ways that no Eastern businessman ever could. Help me build a railroad that serves everyone, not just the wealthy. The council murmured among themselves in their native tongue. Boone caught fragments discussions of the white woman's sincerity. Debates about the risks of trusting another settler. But gradually he sensed the mood shifting. It was then that Montgomery's spy chose to make his presence known. Miss Ravenworth. The man burst into the lodge, his face flushed from hard riding. Mr. Blackwell demands your immediate return. The merger cannot proceed without your signature, and every day of delay costs the company thousands. The temperature in the lodge seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chief Washakie's expression hardened, and several warriors stepped forward protectively. You bring spies to our council? The chief asked coldly. I didn't know, Celestine began, but Montgomery's man interrupted again. Sir, with respect, Miss Ravenworth, is promised in marriage to Mr. Blackwell. This whole expedition is the fancy of a woman who doesn't understand business. The insult hung in the air like smoke. Celestine felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could respond, Boone stood slowly from his place beside her. Friend, he said mildly, though his voice carried undertones of warning. You might want to choose your next words real careful like. And who are you supposed to be? The spy sneered. Her hired muscle. Chief Washakie raised a hand for silence, his keen eyes moving between the confronting men. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations. In our tradition, he said slowly, a woman's word is her bond. If this Celestine Ravenworth says she is free to make agreements, then she is free. He turned to face the spy directly. Your interruption shows disrespect to our council and to her. You will leave our lands immediately. But Montgomery's man had one final card to play. The marriage contract is already signed by her father. Legally, she has no authority to negotiate anything. The words hit Celestine like a physical blow. Around the lodge, she could see doubt creeping into the faces of the council members. Her bold proposal suddenly seemed like the desperate gambit of a woman with no real power. It was Gertie who broke the tense silence. Wandering into the lodge and promptly investigating Chief Washaki's staff with her usual curiosity, the absurdity of the moment, a donkey interrupting a crucial diplomatic meeting, broke some of the tension. Chief Washaki surprised everyone by laughing, a rich sound that filled the lodge. "Your donkey shows more wisdom than this man," he told Celestine. "She judges people by their actions, not their papers." Then his expression grew serious again. "We will give you 3 days to resolve this matter of your freedom. If you can prove your authority to negotiate, we will consider your proposal. If not," he shrugged eloquently. As they prepared to leave the village, Celestine's heart hammered with desperate determination. 3 days to break a marriage contract, outmaneuver Montgomery Blackwell, save both her father's legacy and her own future. But as Boone helped her mount her horse, his strong hands steady and sure, she realized she wasn't facing this battle alone anymore. The showdown came at sunset on the 3rd day, in the very auction yard where this unlikely love story had begun. Word had spread throughout Millbrook about the railroad heiress's rebellion, and half the town had gathered to witness either her triumph or her downfall. Montgomery Blackwell stood on the auctioneer's platform like a conquering general. The marriage contract clutched in one manicured hand and a smug smile playing at his lips. Beside him, Judge Cornelius Hartwell, Montgomery's old friend and frequent poker partner, waited to officiate what he believed would be a swift legal victory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Montgomery announced to the crowd, "we are here to settle a simple matter of law. Miss Ravenworth, despite her recent eccentricities, remains bound by her father's contract. Our wedding will proceed as planned, and the railroad merger will ensure prosperity for all." Celestine rode into the yard atop her father's stallion, her spine straight and her emerald eyes blazing with determination. She'd abandoned her riding clothes for a striking burgundy dress that commanded attention while remaining practical enough for action. Behind her came Boone on his own mount, and behind him, Chief Washaki himself with 3 of his most trusted warriors. The crowd gasped at the unexpected entourage. Montgomery's confident smile faltered slightly. "Chief Washaki," Celestine announced, her voice carrying across the yard, "has agreed to hear our dispute according to the old laws of this territory, laws that predate both the marriage contract and the railroad company." "Preposterous," Montgomery sputtered. "This is American territory governed by American law." But Judge Hartwell, despite his friendship with Montgomery, was also a scholar of territorial law. Weathered face grew, thoughtful as he considered the implications. "Actually," he said slowly, "the chief does have legal standing here. This territory was governed by tribal law before statehood, and certain provisions remain in effect for disputes involving native lands." Chief Washaki stepped forward, his presence commanding instant respect from the assembled crowd. "In our tradition," he said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries, "marriage contracts signed without a woman's consent hold no power. But more than this, we judge people by their actions, not their papers." He gestured toward Celestine. "This woman came to us not as a conqueror, but as a partner. She offered respect and shared prosperity. She brought no armies, no threats, only honest words and an open heart." Then his stern gaze fixed on Montgomery. "You railroad man, sent spies to our council. You speak of owning this woman as if she were cattle. Your actions show the truth of your character." The crowd murmured, sensing the shifting tide. Montgomery's face had gone pale, but he wasn't finished fighting. "Her father signed that contract in good faith," he insisted. "Honor demands." Honor. Boone's voice cut through the evening air like steel. He dismounted slowly, his imposing frame unfolding to its full height. "Honor is treating people with respect, not buying and selling them like property," Montgomery sneered. "And what? Would a failed rancher know about honor? You're nothing but a charity case she picked up at auction." The insult hung in the air, but instead of anger, Boone's expression held something that made Montgomery step back unconsciously, the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. "You're right," Boone said mildly. "Auction. Best thing that ever happened to me, because it brought me to her." He looked at Celestine with such open love that several women in the crowd sighed audibly. "And I'd rather be a charity case with an honest heart than a rich man with a rotten soul." Chief Washaki nodded approvingly. "Well spoken. Now we judge." He turned to address the crowd. "Who here has seen Montgomery Blackwell's actions toward this woman? Who has witnessed his character?" One by one, townspeople stepped forward. Baker spoke of Montgomery's arrogance and cruelty to his employees. The widow, Mrs. Penelope Hartness, testified to his ruthless business dealings that had bankrupted several families. Even Judge Hartwell reluctantly admitted that Montgomery's treatment of Celestine had been somewhat heavy-handed. Then Celestine herself stepped forward. "I choose Boone Coleridge," she announced, her voice ringing clear as church bells. "Not because he's perfect, but because he sees me as a person worth respecting, because he kneels in garden dirt and teaches me about growing things, because he loves me for who I am, not what I own." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. "Chief," Washaki raised his hand for silence. "The tribal council recognizes Celestine Ravenworth's freedom to choose her own path," he declared. "The marriage contract is void. The railroad partnership, however, stands her people will work with her to build something that benefits all." Montgomery's face twisted with rage. "This is illegal. I'll challenge this in federal court." "You do that," Judge Hartwell said mildly. "Though I should mention that interfering with tribal sovereignty is a federal crime. You might want to consult with your lawyers before making threats." As the crowd began to disperse, celebrating the victory of love over greed, Celestine found herself in Boone's arms beneath the first stars of evening. Gertie wandered over to investigate, and somehow their kiss became a three-way embrace that made them both laugh. "So," Boone murmured against her hair, "what happens now?" "Now." Celestine pulled back to look into his storm-gray eyes, her heart full to overflowing. "Now we build something beautiful together. A railroad, a garden, a life." She grinned. "You can handle being married to a railroad baroness?" "I reckon I can manage," he said, spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter. "Though I should warn you, Gertie's got strong opinions about wedding planning," as if summoned by her name. Gertie brayed loudly, earning another round of laughter from the happy couple. 6 months later, their wedding took place in the same garden, where they'd first fallen in love, with Chief Washaki performing the ceremony and Gertie serving as an unofficial maid of honor. The Celestine Shoshone Railroad became the most successful line in the territory, known for its fair treatment of employees and respect for the land, and every morning, former auction lot Cowboy and his railroad heiress wife could be found, working side by side in their garden, teaching each other about the art of growing beautiful things from simple seeds and endless love.